Okay, now that we've taken a look at how we can use the stencil buffer for creating, well, a type of simulated reflection.
Right.
Let's spend a few minutes talking about shadows. Creating real-time shadows with OpenGL is complicated.
It is.
It is extremely complicated. We get into a lot of advanced techniques at this point.
A lot of modifying geometry just to get something to work.
But you don't have a, like a GL enable
shadows.
Wouldn't that be awesome?
That would be so awesome.
Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. Now, when creating shadows, there's multiple ways you can go.
Right. There are things called projective shadows. There are volume shadows that you can use. Just different techniques or hacks, if you will, that allow us to get real-time shadows in our applications.
And that's without getting into the world of pixels or shaders. Exactly.
Right.
Where, of course, you could handle shadows in there.
Right.
But that's also extremely complicated. Unfortunately, there's no easy answer here. So what we're going to do is spend a few minutes talking about a particular technique, and then after showing you exactly what's happening, we're going to point you in the right direction where you can do a lot more reading, and you can also take a look at code snippets and examples. Bottom line is this. For us to go through a stencil buffer shadows technique code-wise would take a large amount of time, which is really outside the scope of the VTM.
Right.
But at the same time, we want to make sure that you guys are aware of this one well-used technique,
right,
and you know where to find additional information. So,
exactly.
Joel, let's go ahead and advance forward a slide. All right, so shadows, hacks, we basically just said all of this a second ago. But again, what we're going to do is use the stencil buffer and a trick, if you will, to pull off the illusion of shadows, just how we similar to how we use the stencil buffer to pull off the illusion of reflections.
Right. Basically, what we're going to be doing is taking the object that's casting shadows and take all of its edges and project it down in the direction where the light is pointing.
That's right.
So, as for every single edge, we need to take that edge, pull it down, and create a polygon for each of those edges. Wow. And that's a very time-consuming process, and it can get very complicated depending on how complex your object is that's casting the shadow.
Exactly. Now, we've got some images for you that are going to kind of walk you through an overview of the process.
Right. So this is the first step that we need to do, and that's just render the entire scene without shadows, obviously.
So what are we looking at here? Our scene consists of a cube.
Right, one cube over here.
That's floating above a floor.
Right. And then we have a light somewhere in the vicinity of this area that's supposed to cast a shadow down like that.
Exactly.
So let's go ahead and advance to the next slide. So that's the first thing you do.
And we render that out to the frame buffer.
We render that out to the frame buffer. The stencil buffer is currently blank. Now what we need to do is, as I said, pull all of those edges down in the direction where the light is pointing, where that light is casting, if you will. And then what we're going to do is render out all the front faces of that to the stencil buffer. So we add into the stencil buffer all this information. So this render front faces image right here, this is after we projected all of those edges down, we rendered only the front faces. So we turned off back face culling.
Exactly.
So in this case, it renders this out. Then we render the back faces, all the back faces of those pulled out or extruded edges, if you will. And that was subtracted from the stencil buffer. So this was the current stencil buffer after rendering the front faces. Then the back faces were rendered, but instead of incrementing the stencil buffer, we decremented everything in the stencil buffer when we rendered something to it. So that ends up being front faces minus what was rendered for the back faces. And what you end up with is a little white section here, which turns out to be the shadow.
Now we can use this to our advantage in simulating a shadow.
Right, because we know exactly where we want to render the shadow. And the next part's easy.
Okay.
Once we have this part, all we need to do, and let me just advance to the next slide, you notice we put a shadow here. And what we did here was we render an entire rectangle over the entire viewport, over the entire viewing area or frame buffer, and simply utilize the stencil buffer so that we only draw in that particular area.
Exactly. Well, the whole thing is, it's just a matter of the opacity.
Right.
And controlling exactly how dark our shadow is going to be if we're going to see or not see anything there. So in this case, the area that we're rendering, the shadowed area, depending on how transparent it is going to control just how dark that shadow is.
Right. So we just rendered a giant rectangle or a quad over the entire viewport, set its transparency, and utilize the stencil buffer so that we only draw in the white area, and bam, we've got a shadow.
There you go. So again, it's building on some of the things we talked about in the last video.
Right.
And then we're getting into a whole lot of new stuff, and how do you find those edges? How do you project them based off where our light's at, et cetera. And again, this gets into a very complicated subject that this VTM
really goes outside the scope.
Yeah, it goes outside the scope of the VTM. But don't worry, we're not leaving you empty-handed. Let's go ahead and advance on to the next slide. We've got a couple of places that you can go to do some additional reading so that you could experiment with this.
At OpenGL.org, aside from the advanced notes that they have at their website, that discusses a variety of techniques.
It does.
From projective shadows, as I mentioned.
As a matter
of fact,
if you want to bring it up real quick.
Sure. Right here, we have in OpenGL.org, the Advanced 97 section. They talk about a lot of different techniques, not only in shadows, if you go to their main context section, but they have projection shadows, they have shadow volumes, which is the method we were discussing, shadow maps, which is another commonly used technique.
Jump into the shadow volumes real quick. So here we go. Yeah, and a picture that they're providing.
Right.
Which is a lot harder to understand just looking at it compared to ours.
Yeah, very difficult to understand. But then they outline the entire steps needed to get this whole job done.
Exactly, and you can see it's a lot more involved.
Yeah, very involved.
So again, another overview and another website that we've provided the link for as well if we want to come over to the other browser. So over here at 3D Drone, you can see if we just kind of scroll through this, again, a lot of code snippets, suggestions, ideas, the whole 9 yards.
Right.
So hopefully between these two locations you can pull together enough information to start applying shadows to your scene.
Definitely.
The bottom line, again, is to introduce you to the concept of using the stencil buffers for doing the shadow volumes technique. And that's pretty much it.
Right.
So that's going to wrap up this video, and thanks a lot.